My name is Fergus Evans. I'm a poet and performance maker. I am originally from the US, from the southeast bit of the US, Georgia, but now I'm based in Brighton. ROVE is an hour-long show which incorporates storytelling, spoken word, conversation, folk music and soundscaping. The show is about family anecdotes and how they change over time and whether or not we can ever discover the truth behind stories. The show is definitely drawn entirely from my own experience and my own family's history. We were really interested in starting with a specific song that my mother said that she sang to me while I was growing up, though I didn't remember her singing me the song. So we started with the story that the song describes, a gypsy rover, and use that as a framework to think about different stories within my own family's history. My writing tends to be really interested in a lot of the same things which are explored in folk music, which is, sort of simple, very personal stories. So there felt like a lot of overlap between sort of my style of storytelling and folk music, but this is the first time I've incorporated live music into a performance. The week here in Exeter at the Bike Shed has been really, really amazing. We've had some really warm, lovely audiences, and for someone who night after night tells such an honest and personal story, it's really nice to feel like you're in a room full of people who care about what you have to say, who are really listening. Sometimes you're in a room full of people who make it really easy to talk to them. That's good.
I'm just a poor, wayfaring stranger, traveling through this world of woe. Yes, there's no sickness, toil nor danger in that bright land to which I go. I'm going there to see my mother. I'm going there no more to roam. I'm only going over Georgia. I'm only going over home. I know dark clouds will gather round me. I know my way is rough and steep, yet golden fields lie just before me, where weary eyes shall no more weep. I'm going there to see my father. He said they'd meet me when I come. I'm only going over Georgia. I'm only going over home.
This is the one and only time I know of that Rover Joe ever fell in love. Chicago. And the sound of jazz sticks to the sidewalks. The click of high heels and high balls and fast cars has Rover Joe's fingers beating out a blues rhythm on his ribcage. His feet shuffle out the drum and snare of a song he once knew, one about a laddie just like him. And on a day like today, maybe it could have been him. Maybe he won the heart of a lady. Maybe today he will win a lady's heart. It's easy enough in this town. all these Aileen's and Eileen's and Kathleen's and Sheena's, just hoping for a taste of home, a bit of the old country. Chicago.
Okay, so that was J. Fergus Evans talking about his show ROVE. So now then, Naomi, what tell us about your experience at ROVE.
Well, I loved it. I was transported, I have to say. They're very engaging people, and I don't know, maybe I just needed some transporting away. I don't think I knew nothing about it. Came into the room and it was just, it felt quite magical actually. I have sort of colours in my head and a very gentle feel of this, as he was saying, very sort of personal, intimate story. I thought it was very lovely and very touching.
And Chloe.
Yes, similar. I had seen the show a few months before in London, so I'm just trying to, because it's always different when you see it a second time round, but conjuring up that kind of first experience of it. I was definitely transported and kind of really enjoyed being in quite different worlds, like being in the poetic world and then kind of being brought back down and sort of grounded in the now world, and that kind of talking to the audience, being in the present with you was a really lovely kind of stretch of my imagination and emotions. You kind of you float away with the imagery and then you kind of get pulled back. And I was definitely sort of emotionally moved. I think I'm a bit of a softie anyway, but it was one of the sort of first times that I thought, God, I could cry out loud. That kind of guttural emotion that he sort of took me to. And that was a pleasure, but also, quite intense. I definitely needed a whiskey after it.
Okay. Well, this is one of my questions really about it, because it did feel as if it was kind of at times anyway, well, most of the time, a bit laden with grief, actually. Do you think there was... I wondered about the emotion that was portrayed and whether that was real, honest emotion or whether that was performative. That doesn't... that's not a criticism, by the way. It's just I'm wondering how one performs like that, day after day after day, yes, I'm interested in that and whether there was a catharsis going on for the performer or not.
I imagine it's hard to know, isn't it, without being able to ask him. But from the impression I have of him as an individual, he is a very open and honest person. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if each night he was kind of going to that place, not as a performative kind of front, but as an actual exploration of his own emotions. And it came across like that. I think as human beings, we're really, really good at noticing when someone's lying. You've got to be excellent at being able to hide that kind of emotion in a sense of like, it's not, I'm not really going there, but I'm kind of going there. Okay. So for me, it definitely felt like it was a genuine for him.
It felt uncomfortable enough to me for me to feel that was real, and yeah, I felt that it was actual, as you say. I mean, hopefully cathartic, and maybe there's a point at which he can't do this anymore because he can't bring that emotion into it, because maybe it's done its job. I don't know. Maybe that will happen in the future, but I think it seemed to me like a real journey and a real need, the real issue he was talking about, you know, passing on this story and genuinely sort of passing it on.
The survivor needs to tell the story. Exactly. I think that was a repeated motif, and actually there were several repeated motifs during the piece. What did you think about that, his use of repetition?
Yes, I liked it, all of that. The repetition in the images, so this doesn't work on radio, but he conjured up Chicago. I mean, he would say the word and you would have some music and the light would change, but he also drew the skyline of Chicago with his fingers, and he took time doing it, so that you were following it and thinking, this is really slow, and is he going to do this every time? But actually, every time when he did it, I was transported and I was visualising it in my head. I've never been there, but he managed to take me there, and I felt that repetition was part of the strength, actually, of dancing backwards and forwards again in time, a bit like the last piece. But somehow, yes, it was. Felt that was very strong, and the repetition really worked.
Yeah, it was like little keys for the audience, you know, to kind of unlock where we were going. Or is that a good analogy? I don't know. But like, you know, sort of reference points where we could go, okay, I know where we're going now. And I think often that can be over-laboured. People can use it in a way that is kind of like being really obvious, but like what Naomi was saying, the kind of the simplicity of the kind of repetition of those motifs just was like, okay, I'm kind of there with you.
Great. And I was thinking about the way those repetitions sometimes seemed like the chorus to a verse, and I was thinking about the folk music and the way he used folk music and the folk roots, and the way he used autobiography in that, and the connections between that. What did you have any thoughts about the connection between the music and the personal story?
Yeah, well, again, because it's based around this song that he can't remember, you know, that it's quite emotive anyway, this sort of idea that you're constantly grasping for something that you're never going to be able to find. And the folk music, and there was a lovely phrase that the musician Rhiannon used, and he sort of quoted her on it. Apparently this had come out whilst they'd been working on the piece, about folk music being in 1/1 time, if I remembered that quote correctly. And I found that very interesting, particularly listening whilst I was doing the washing up to Radio 3 at the weekend, who had a whole weekend of music and what it's about and what it's for. Sorry to quote another radio programme, how dare I? But it was very interesting because they were talking about how speech maybe came from birdsong, and how folk music actually follows speech rhythms, and how the idea that it's just this absolute necessity. It's not a sort of, we're going to invent music and we're going to create this artificial time. It comes from our very way of expressing ourselves and the need to communicate. And so that in itself, using the music and using that idea of music played to unborn children and music played to babies is what they recognise, and this kind of innate understanding of it was just fascinating. So that sort of deepened for me actually over the weekend. It kept taking me back to the piece.
Yeah, I thought the musical element added like another dimension to it, because I think music as a form is a whole language in itself, and it allows you to go places that, you know, theatre and visual art can't go. It's very, for me, it's very visceral, and it's like it instantly transports me back to a place or an emotion, a little bit like smells do. You know, you kind of it's I don't know how to describe it, but it's like an instant sensory reaction that you have, which for me again sort of brought a depth to the text and the sort of other performance style of it. And also, like, I think I recognised some of the songs as well. You know, you kind of go, I kind of know that song, which I think happens quite a lot with folk music. You kind of go, I know that one, but I don't know it, but there's something in there. so I thought, and also there's something about the vulnerability of singing, like just voices, and the two, Rhiannon and Fergus, singing together, and the really kind of close harmonies that they were doing. Just that kind, again, added to that kind of open, vulnerable sort of performance style that really kind of drew you in to kind of be listening and be there with them.
And the other, what was very interesting, so there were lots of other kind of little performance elements, which that sounds a bit contrived. Actually, it didn't mean, but there were things that just struck chords with me. There was a moment when they suddenly just looked at each other. They wanted to just look into each other's eyes, which was beautiful and worked. I actually wanted it to go on longer. There were a few elements that they brought in. There was a piece with playing the music in a bowl on stage and having a microphone in it, which was just created this wonderful sound. And I actually wished they'd done more. And the piece with the eyes, just looking into each other's eyes, really reminded me of a Marina Abramovich, where she sat opposite, so a performance artist who just sat in a room and asked members of the public to come and sit opposite her to share, was it 1 minute or several minutes of just looking at each other. And it's a thing that's cropped up on YouTube all of a sudden. There have been people sitting in the high street and inviting people to come and say, as this idea of sharing with each other just through that, actually looking intensely at each other, which this piece, the whole piece, managed to do in a way. Just look at me, I'm bearing everything. You can see everything inside. Yeah. And how emotional and how that really worked.
Yes, I thought that there was. I did think that the whole thing of making a connection, Fergus making a connection, and the LGBT content as well, that he didn't labour in any way at all about him being gay, but it seemed to transfer across very easily and become every person's story, even though it was about a very particular one to him. Did you find that you easily made a connection? It sounds as if you did with him.
Yeah. Well, because every family's got a history, hasn't it? And that's kind of, he sort of mentions it at the beginning, like, there's those stories that you get told by your parents that they've kind of made up a little bit about their parents or their grandparents, and so it definitely felt like, something that that I could kind of go, oh yeah, thinking about those stories and whether or not they're true, and how your grandparents met and how your parents met, and all those moments that have happened before you but have got you to where you are now, so I definitely felt, like you say, that it was his story, but so many ways in for it to be everyone's story.
And just the way he, as you say, the way he introduced that was just so gently full of humour, wasn't it? It was a joke. It was almost an aside, but it was just very gentle and, like you say, very.
But in actual fact, it carried so much of the sadness because of him not being able to pass it on in a way. He would not be a father, and therefore that was such a huge.
And you felt that
the
the sadness and the weight of his responsibility somehow, that was part of his role and he wouldn't be able to carry it out, and he had somehow failed all of these people. That was really, really touching, and really struck a chord with me, particularly the whole thing about memory and trying to recapture memories that you don't remember. And
then the importance of the audience's role as well within that, this idea of the survivor tells the story, and him sort of passing that on to the audience, and as I imagine as each individual within that audience, although we're there all together, I think as individuals we felt that kind of like, okay, I need to tell the story, but I don't, but it wasn't like I need to tell it, but it's like
maybe just, but I think having it within you, because you're always going to now have something that retain that memory of that show and part of him. So he has, in fact, he's passed on something of himself to you, because if I ever hear that song again, I'm now going to think of him. There's certain things that I'm just, that show that I saw at. So I think that is perhaps the happy point, the joy in it, is that maybe passing these things on doesn't have to be a sort of one way. You have to have a baby and it has to be called Fergus, and it has to be, you know, this idea that we have to pass things on in the same way, and it has to be done through having children, and success is all the same thing. Actually, maybe that's the hopeful point about you can pass things on in so many different ways, and you can inspire people by doing that. So that's what I took away from it, is actually he's succeeded. You know, he is succeeding all the time because actually he's sharing it with all of those hundreds of people, hopefully.
We'll all now change their name to Fergus.
We'll call their children Fergus. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I mean, there's still, as you can hear from us all, a lot of emotion about that piece, and joy and sadness too. And you can find out more about Fergus, his story and his other projects at www.jfergusevans.com. You're listening to Culture and Review on Phonic FM with me, Josie Sutcliffe, and my guests Chloe Whipple and Naomi Hart. We're live. Don't forget you can tweet us at PhonicCR and email culture@phonic.fm. And you can listen again to this and previous programmes via phonic.fm/culture.